I'm Marcus Chen, 47, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew everything about the company I'd built from the ground up. 23 years of blood, sweat, and 18-hour days had created a logistics empire worth $200 million. I trusted my executive team completely. They were family, or so I believed. Then my daughter, Emma, came home from her summer job at one of our warehouses, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, your managers are monsters," she whispered. "They're destroying people's lives." That night I made a decision that would shatter everything I thought I knew about leadership, loyalty, and the human cost of success. I went undercover as Mike Rodriguez, a desperate 45-year-old seeking minimum wage work at my own company. What I discovered in those fluorescent-lit warehouses didn't just break my heart. It ignited a fire that would burn through the executive suite and expose the rot at the core of my empire. Sometimes the hardest person to face in the mirror is yourself. I keep it in my desk drawer, that crumpled, coffee-stained business plan I wrote 23 years ago. The handwriting is barely legible, the numbers optimistic to the point of delusion, but the mission statement still makes my chest tighten. To create a company that treats every worker with dignity while building something meaningful for our families. My father had worked 16-hour days in a textile factory, his hands permanently stained from machinery oil, his spirit slowly crushed by supervisors who saw him as expendable. When he died at 58, his last words to me were in broken English. "Marcus, you be different. You build something good." Chen Logistics started with a single delivery truck and a $15,000 loan. I was 24, freshly graduated with a business degree, and naive enough to believe that success and integrity could coexist. Those first years, I knew every driver by name, every warehouse worker's family situation. When Maria started working, for us the same Maria who would later become central to my awakening, personally helped her find childcare so she could take the night shift. But empires have a way of growing beyond their founder's vision. What started as a family business gradually transformed into something else entirely. As we expanded from one warehouse to 50, from 10 employees to 3,000, the personal connections that had once defined us became impossible to maintain. I found myself spending more time in boardrooms than on warehouse floors, more familiar with quarterly projections than the faces of the people who made those numbers possible. The executive team I assembled reflected my trust and delegation. James Morrison, my CFO, had been with me for 15 years. I'd hired him straight out of Harvard, impressed by his analytical mind and apparent dedication to the company's values. Sandra Walsh, our operations director, had started as a floor supervisor and worked her way up, or so I thought. These weren't just employees. They were the people I'd trusted to carry forward the vision my father had inspired. Looking back, I realized the warning signs were always there. The gradual shift in company culture, the increasing focus on efficiency over humanity, the way conversations about worker welfare became increasingly rare in executive meetings. But success has a way of insulating you from inconvenient truths. When your company is growing at 20% annually and your stock options are making you wealthy beyond your immigrant father's wildest dreams, it's easy to assume that everyone is sharing in that prosperity. The boardroom became my world. Mahogany tables, expensive suits, and reports that reduced human beings to data points. Worker productivity was up, turnover was within acceptable industry standards, and profit margins were healthy. The numbers told a story of success, and I had no reason to question the narrative my trusted executives presented. But numbers, I would learn, can lie as easily as people. Behind every percentage point of increased productivity was a human being pushed to their breaking point. Behind every cost-saving measure was a family struggling to make ends meet. The empire I'd built to honor my father's memory had become the very system he'd suffered under. The distance between the executive suite and the warehouse floor wasn't just physical, it was moral, emotional, and ultimately, spiritual. I had become the kind of leader I'd once sworn never to be. One who knew everything about his business except what it was doing to the people who made it possible. The transformation began with a trip to Goodwill. Standing in the floor, a store surrounded by discarded clothing and the musty smell of other people's lives, I felt like I was entering a foreign country. I'd forgotten what it felt like to worry about the price of a shirt, to calculate whether I could afford both work boots and a decent meal. I selected clothes that would make me invisible, faded jeans with worn knees, a plain gray t-shirt with a small stain near the collar, and work boots that had seen better days. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at me as she rang up my purchases. I was already becoming nobody. Creating Mike Rodriguez's identity required more than just clothes. I spent days crafting a background story that would hold up under scrutiny. Divorced father of 2, struggling to make ends meet after a factory closure. No college degree, sporadic employment history, desperate enough to take any job that paid. I practiced his voice in my car, less polished, more hesitant, with the weight of financial anxiety affecting every word. The fake ID and resume were easier to obtain than I'd expected. In a city where desperation was common, services existed to help people reinvent themselves, usually for far less noble reasons than mine. Mike Rodriguez had a social security number, a sketchy but plausible work history, and references that would check out under casual scrutiny. But the hardest part wasn't creating the paperwork. It was learning to think like Mike. Marcus Chen made decisions that affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. Mike Rodriguez worried about whether he could afford lunch after paying for bus fare. The mental shift was more disorienting than I'd anticipated. I practiced at a mirror, studying the way financial stress changed a person's posture, the way uncertainty crept into their voice. I let my beard grow out, stopped using hair product, and traded my tailored suits for the uniform of economic desperation. The man looking back at me from the mirror wasn't Marcus Chen, successful CEO. He was Mike Rodriguez, another casualty of an economy that chewed up working people and spat them out. The first job interview was humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sitting in a plastic chair in a sterile office, being questioned by a hiring manager half my age about my ability to lift 50 pounds and work on my feet for 8 hours, I felt the full weight of what my employees experienced daily. The interviewer looked through me, not at me, as if I were a machine being evaluated for purchase rather than a human being seeking dignity through work. "We'll call you if something opens up," became a familiar refrain. The casual dismissal, the way potential employers treated my fictitious experience as insufficient, the assumption that someone my age applying for minimum wage work was probably unreliably it, all built a picture of systemic dehumanization I'd never fully grasped from my executive perch. When Chen Logistics finally called Mike Rodriguez for an interview, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. I was about to infiltrate my own company, to see it through the eyes of the people whose labor made my success possible. The receptionist who greeted me was polite but distant, processing me like any other desperate applicant rather than recognizing the man who signed her paychecks. The hiring manager, someone I'd never met despite being the company's founder, treated me with the same casual indifference I'd experienced elsewhere. I was just another body to fill a slot, another expendable resource in the machine I'd created. As I signed the paperwork that would make Mike Rodriguez an official employee of Chen Logistics, I realized I was about to discover what my empire really looked like from the inside. The employee handbook they handed me on my first day was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, 43 pages of policies that looked progressive on paper but crumbled under the weight of reality. Chen Logistics values every team member and is committed to providing a safe, respectful workplace where all employees can thrive. The words mocked me as I stood in the pre-dawn darkness with 30 other new hires, waiting for the warehouse doors to open. The orientation video featured a younger version of myself, speaking earnestly about our company culture and commitment to employee welfare. Watching it as Mike Rodriguez, I felt a surge of self-doubt. How had I become so disconnected from the reality of what my company had become? The other workers around me looked tired, resigned, as if they'd heard these promises before and learned not to believe them. Kevin Martinez, our shift supervisor, introduced himself with the enthusiasm of a prison warden. "Listen up, people. I don't care what that video told you. This is the real world. You're here to move boxes, not to make friends. You don't meet your quota, you don't work here. You cause problems, you don't work here. You waste time, you don't work here." Questions. The warehouse floor stretched out like an aircraft hangar, filled with towering shelves and the constant hum of machinery. The employee handbook promised adequate climate control, but the summer heat was already building. Despite the early hour, by noon, I knew this place would be unbearable. They assigned me to the picking line, where I'd spend the next 8 hours grabbing items from shelves and placing them in boxes. The quota was aggressive: 180 items per hour, with a 2-minute bathroom break allowance per shift. The handbook mentioned reasonable break periods, but Kevin made it clear that reasonable meant barely enough time to use the restroom and get back to your station. My first picking partner was David, a man in his 60s who'd been with the company for 8 years. His hands were gnarled from repetitive motion, and he moved with the careful precision of someone managing chronic pain. "Don't let them see you slow down," he whispered as we worked. "They're always watching. Cameras, everywhere, and they got quotas to meet upstairs." The cameras were indeed everywhere, not just security cameras, but productivity monitors that tracked every movement, every second of downtime. The handbook spoke of performance optimization tools, but what I saw was a surveillance state that would make Orwell proud. Workers moved with the mechanical precision of people who knew they were being watched, judged, and potentially discarded based on metrics that reduced human beings to productivity statistics. The bathroom policy was particularly cruel. Had to request permission from supervisors, who would note the time and duration of each break. Take too long, and you'd be written up. Take too many breaks, and you'd be terminated. The handbook mentioned reasonable accommodation for personal needs, but the reality was a systematic dehumanization that treated basic biological functions as inconveniences to be minimized. By lunch, my back was screaming and my hands were cramping. The employee handbook promised a comfortable break area, but the reality was a windowless room with vending machines and plastic chairs. Most workers brought their own food. The vending machine prices were prohibitive on minimum wage, and the nearest restaurants were too far away for a 30-minute lunch break. I sat next to Rosa, a woman in her 40s who'd been working the picking line for 3 years. She was eating a peanut butter sandwich and drinking water from a plastic bottle she'd refilled from the bathroom tap. "You get used to it," she said, noticing my exhaustion. "Or you quit." Not many other options. The afternoon brought new horrors. The heat had built to dangerous levels, but the fans were broken and wouldn't be fixed until the next maintenance cycle. Workers were dropping like flies, some from heat exhaustion, others from the relentless pace. The handbook mentioned comprehensive health and safety protocols, but supervisors were more concerned with maintaining productivity than worker welfare. When someone collapsed near the loading dock, Kevin's first concern wasn't the workers' health, it was whether the incident would slow down the line. "Get back to work, people. Paramedics got this handled." The casualness with which human suffering was dismissed revealed the true culture of my company. A culture that had metastasized while I'd been focused on quarterly reports and board meetings. The employee handbook was more than just a document, it was a lie. A carefully crafted fiction designed to provide legal protection while obscuring the reality of systematic abuse. Every policy had been written by lawyers to sound humane while leaving enough loopholes to justify treating workers as expendable resources. As my first shift finally ended, I understood that I wasn't just observing a broken system, I was experiencing it, the ache in my joints, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, the slow erosion of dignity that came from being treated as less than human. This wasn't just a workplace, it was a machine designed to extract maximum value from human beings, while giving back as little as possible in return. Asterisk. Maria Gonzalez kept a cracked family photo taped to her workstation, 3 children, smiling. From happier times, before medical bills and broken promises had worn her down to bone and determination. She'd been with Chen Logistics for 6 years, long enough to remember when supervisors knew workers' names, and Christmas bonuses weren't just rumors. "I used to work days," she told me during our 15-minute break, her voice barely audible, "over the warehouse machinery. But they cut ours. Said we were overstaffed. Now I work nights, sleep for hours, then pick up my kids from school. My oldest, Carmen, she's 12. She makes dinner for her little brothers because mommy's always working." The photograph showed a different Maria, fuller cheeks, eyes that held hope instead of resignation. This Maria was hollow-eyed, her uniform hanging loose on a frame that had been worn down by stress and inadequate nutrition. She'd aged a decade in the 6 years since I'd last seen her. Back when I actually walked the warehouse floors and knew my employees as people rather than productivity metrics. "The worst part isn't the work," she continued, carefully unwrapping a sandwich that looked like it had been made from whatever was cheapest at the grocery store. "It's the quotas. They keep raising them. Used to be 120 items per hour. Now it's 180. Next month, they say it'll be 200. You miss quota 3 times, you're gone. No warnings, no second chances." I watched her eat with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd learned to consume fuel rather than enjoy food. Every bite was calculated, every moment of rest borrowed against the relentless demands of production targets that had been set by executives who'd never spent a day on the warehouse floor. "My supervisor, Kevin, he's not a bad man," Maria said, though the words sounded like she was trying to convince herself, "but he's got his own quotas to meet. Upper management? They don't care about us. We're just numbers on a spreadsheet. When someone gets injured, they don't ask if they're okay, they ask if it'll affect productivity." The injury she mentioned wasn't hypothetical. Last month, a coworker named James had torn his rotator cuff reaching for a high shelf. Instead of proper medical attention, he'd been given ibuprofen and told to work through it. When he finally couldn't lift his arm, they'd terminated him for performance issues rather than filing a workers' compensation claim. "Company policy says we get health insurance." Maria laughed bitterly. "Sure, they provide insurance. But the deductible is so high, might as well not have it. My son broke his arm last year, cost me 3 months' salary. Had to choose between paying rent and paying the hospital. Guess which one couldn't wait." The faces around us told similar stories. Roberto, who'd been working double shifts to pay for his daughter's wedding, moving like a man 20 years older than his actual age. Patricia, whose arthritis was getting worse but who couldn't afford to see a doctor, pushing through pain that would have sent most people to the emergency room. These weren't just employees, they were casualties of a system that had prioritized profit over human dignity. "You know what really gets me?" Maria's voice carried an anger that had been building for years. "The executives, they get bonuses when we hit our numbers. Big bonuses. They buy new cars, take vacations, send their kids to private schools. Meanwhile, we're the ones doing the work, and we can't even afford to fix our cars when they break down." The broken system revealed itself in small details. The time clock that was deliberately slow, shaving minutes off each shift. The vending machines that were constantly broken, forcing workers to choose between eating and losing break time. The parking lot that flooded every time it rained, but maintenance was too expensive to fix. Each indignity was small enough to seem insignificant, but together they created an environment of systematic dehumanization. I applied for a promotion last year, Maria continued, her eyes fixed on the photograph of her children. Supervisor, position, had the experience, good performance reviews, but they gave it to someone's nephew instead. Kid was 22, never worked a day in his life. That's when I knew we're not people here. We're just bodies to use up and throw away. The 15-minute break was ending, and workers were reluctantly returning to their stations. Maria carefully folded the photograph and put it back in her pocket, transforming from a mother and human being back into employee number 4487. Watching her walk away, I felt a rage building that had nothing to do with Mike Rodriguez and everything to do with the man who'd let this happen. The faces of desperation weren't just in the workers, they were in the supervisors too. People caught between impossible demands from above and the human cost of meeting those demands. The system I'd created had turned everyone into victims. From the warehouse floor to the management offices, each person grinding down the people below them to satisfy the inexorable demands of quarterly growth. As I returned to my own station, I realized that every efficiency improvement, every cost-saving measure, every productivity increase I'd celebrated in board meetings had come at a human cost I'd never bothered to calculate. The empire I'd built wasn't just extracting value from workers, it was extracting their humanity, their dignity, their hope for a better future. Asterisk, the productivity reports arrived every Monday morning, neat spreadsheets that transformed human suffering into executive bonuses. I'd seen these reports countless times from my CEO perspective, but experiencing them from Mike Rodriguez's vantage point revealed their true nature, a systematic measurement of how much misery could be extracted from each worker while maintaining plausible deniability. Kevin Martinez carried the latest report like a weapon, reading off numbers that determined who would eat this week and who would be sleeping in their cars. Team B, your efficiency dropped 2% last week. That's unacceptable. Team C, good work hitting 198 items per hour. That's the standard now for everyone. The numbers were beautiful in their simplicity and horrifying in their implications. Each percentage point represented someone's breaking point, someone's family, pushed deeper into poverty, someone's body pushed beyond its limits. The reports never mentioned the human cost, the injuries that went unreported, the families torn apart by impossible schedules, the slow degradation of hope that accompanied each quota increase. Behind me, David was struggling. His arthritic hands, which had once been skilled enough to work as a mechanic, now betrayed him daily. The reports showed his productivity declining, but they didn't show the pain medication he couldn't afford, or the physical therapy that wasn't covered by our inadequate insurance. To the spreadsheet, he was just a underperforming asset requiring replacement. Bathroom breaks are being monitored more carefully, Kevin announced, consulting another report. Average time is 37 seconds over acceptable limits. That's 37 seconds per person, per break, multiplied by 3 shifts, 7 days a week. You're stealing company time. The mathematics of dehumanization was precise and ruthless. Every human need was quantified, measured, and minimized. Bathroom breaks were theft, conversations were time fraud, exhaustion was performance failure. The reports reduced complex human beings to simple input-output equations, where the only variable that mattered was extraction efficiency. I learned that the quota system wasn't just about productivity, it was about control. The numbers were set just high enough to ensure constant anxiety, constant pressure, constant fear of termination. Workers who met this week's targets knew that next week's would be higher. There was no winning, only temporary reprieve from losing. The most insidious aspect was how the reports created competition among workers. Team rankings were posted publicly, encouraging departments to sabotage each other rather than recognizing their common enemy. Workers who might have found strength in solidarity were instead turned against each other, fighting for scraps while the real wealth flowed upward. Executive bonuses are tied to these numbers, Rosa whispered during one of our rare moments of privacy. My cousin works in accounting. She says the managers get thousands of dollars every quarter when we hit targets. Meanwhile, we haven't seen a real raise in 4 years. The bonus structure was perfectly designed to incentivize cruelty. Every bathroom break denied, every sick day discouraged, every safety shortcut taken translated directly into executive compensation. The reports made it clear that worker welfare and management profit were inversely related. The more we suffered, the more they earned. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical toll. The constant monitoring, the public rankings, the ever-increasing demands created an environment where workers began to internalize their own dehumanization. People started apologizing for being human, for needing breaks, for having families, for getting sick. I watched Maria check her numbers compulsively, her anxiety visibly increasing when she fell behind. The reports had trained her to measure her own worth in items per hour, to judge her value as a human being by her ability to satisfy an arbitrary mathematical formula created by people who'd never lifted a box in their lives. The reports never mentioned the real costs of their efficiency. Improvements? They didn't calculate the marriages destroyed by impossible schedules, the children growing up without parents, the communities devastated by poverty wages. They measured everything except what actually mattered, the human cost of treating people as disposable resources. During lunch, I found myself staring at the latest productivity report, seeing it with new eyes. Each number represented a choice to prioritize profit over people, efficiency over empathy, shareholder value over human dignity. The reports weren't just measuring productivity. They were measuring how successfully we'd abandoned our humanity in pursuit of quarterly growth. The genius of the system was how it absolved everyone of responsibility. The executives could point to the numbers and claim they were just following data. The supervisors could claim they were just following orders. The workers could claim they were just trying to survive. But the reports revealed the truth: we were all participants in a system designed to extract maximum value from human suffering while distributing the benefits to those who contributed least to actually creating that value. The termination letter was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty, a form letter that could destroy a life with the efficiency of a machine. Dear employee, due to performance issues beyond acceptable parameters, your employment with Chen Logistics is terminated, effective immediately. No signature, no personal touch, just the cold mathematics of human disposal. I watched Kevin hand the letter to Janet Morrison, a woman in her 50s who'd been with the company for 11 years. Her crime wasn't theft or misconduct, it was the unforgivable sin of being human in an inhuman system. Her productivity had dropped after her husband's cancer diagnosis, her attention divided between impossible quotas and impossible choices. I need this job, she pleaded, her voice breaking. My husband's treatment's the insurance, we can't afford to lose the insurance. Her words echoed in the cavernous warehouse, swallowed by the indifferent hum of machinery that would continue running regardless of human suffering. Kevin's face showed no emotion as he recited the legal script he'd memorized. The decision is final. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your final paycheck will be available Friday. The bureaucratic language masked the reality. Of family was being destroyed by spreadsheet calculations. A life's work dismissed as insufficient return on investment. The breaking point wasn't just Jeanette's, it was systemic. All around me, I could see the cracks in people's facades. The moment when dignity finally crumbled under the weight of systematic dehumanization. Roberto, who'd been working double shifts, finally collapsed during his 15th hour of continuous work. Patricia, whose arthritis had worsened to the point where she couldn't grip packages properly, was crying quietly at her station as her numbers fell further behind. The safety violations were everywhere. Once you knew how to look: emergency exits, blocked by inventory, fire extinguishers that hadn't been inspected in years, first aid stations that were empty or inaccessible. The warehouse was a disaster waiting to happen, but disasters were abstractly possible while productivity targets were immediately measurable. I witnessed the cover-up system in action when Miguel slipped on a wet floor and twisted his ankle. Instead of calling for medical attention, the supervisor's first action was to check if there were any witnesses, any cameras that might have caught the incident. You were moving too fast, he told Miguel. That's not a workplace injury. That's employee carelessness. The forms were already prepared, incident reports that shifted blame from systematic negligence to individual failure. Miguel, who couldn't afford to lose his job, signed the papers that absolved the company of responsibility for his injury. The alternative was termination for failure to follow safety protocols that existed only on paper. The breaking points weren't just physical, they were psychological, emotional, spiritual. I watched people who'd once had pride in their work transformed into hollow shells, going through the motions of productivity while their souls slowly died. The constant surveillance, the impossible demands, the systematic erosion of dignity created an environment where survival required abandoning everything that made life worth living. The termination letters were just the final step in a process that had been breaking people systematically for years. By the time someone received their letter, they'd already been broken down, worn away, reduced to the point where their dismissal felt almost merciful. The system had succeeded in making its own cruelty seem inevitable. Maria found me during break, her face streaked with tears. They gave Janet's job to a temp worker, she said. Someone who'll work for less money, no benefits, no job security. That's what we're all being replaced with, people who are even more desperate than we are. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The systematic cruelty wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. The breaking points weren't accidents, but carefully calculated outcomes designed to maintain a workforce that was too desperate to resist, too frightened to organize, too broken to demand better treatment. The termination letters were more than just employment documentation, were weapons in a war against human dignity. Each one sent a message to the remaining workers. This could be you. Stay quiet, work harder, accept less, because the alternative is joining the ranks of the disposable. As I watched security escort Janet from the building, her 11 years of service reduced to a cardboard box of personal belongings, I felt something inside me finally snap. The rage that had been building for weeks crystallized into a cold, focused determination. The system I'd created had to be destroyed, and I was the only one with the power to do it. The breaking points weren't just affecting the workers, they were affecting me. Mike Rodriguez was experiencing the full weight of systematic oppression, but Marcus Chen was remembering what it felt like to have the power to change things. The question was whether I'd have the courage to use that power, even if it meant destroying everything I'd built. The board meeting minutes were a work of fiction, carefully crafted documents that transformed systematic abuse into operational excellence. I'd read hundreds of these reports as CEO, trusting the sanitized language that made cruelty sound like strategy. Now, hiding in a supply closet during my break, I was reading them with new eyes, the eyes of someone who'd experienced the reality behind the euphemisms. Workforce optimization initiatives have yielded significant productivity gains. Read the latest quarterly report. The translation was simple. We'd pushed workers beyond their breaking points and celebrated the results. Streamlined break protocols have reduced operational inefficiencies by 12%. We'd stolen time from exhausted people and called it progress, but the real revelation came when I managed to overhear an actual management meeting. The maintenance closet adjacent to the conference room had thin walls and poor soundproofing, a fact I'd never noticed during my executive tenure, but which now provided invaluable intelligence about my own company's operations. James Moore's voice carried clearly through the wall as he presented the latest figures. Labor costs are down 8% year-over-year, primarily through enhanced productivity monitoring and strategic workforce reduction. Enhanced productivity monitoring, the surveillance state that treated workers like criminals. Strategic workforce reduction, the systematic elimination of anyone who couldn't keep up with impossible demands. What about the safety incidents? Sandra Walsh asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer wouldn't concern her. Within acceptable parameters, James replied. Legal says, as long as we document everything as employee error rather than systemic issues, we're protected. The key is maintaining plausible deniability. The casual discussion of covering up safety violations made my blood run cold. These weren't faceless corporate villains, these were people I'd trusted, people I'd mentored, people who'd sat at my dinner table and played with my children. They were systematically destroying lives while creating elaborate documentation to protect themselves from consequences. The CEO still asking questions about workplace conditions. Sandra's voice carried a note of amusement that felt like a knife in my chest. Marcus is focused on the big picture, James said with obvious condescension. He doesn't need to worry about operational details. That's what we're here for. As long as the numbers look good, he's happy. The betrayal was complete. Not only had they built this system of abuse, they'd deliberately hidden it from me while using my trust to provide cover for their actions. Every board meeting where they'd assured me that employee welfare was a priority, every report that had praised our industry-leading workplace policies, all lies designed to keep me insulated from the reality of what my company had become. The union organizer was handled quietly, Sandra continued, terminated for attendance issues, though of course the real reason was different. Can't have the workers getting ideas about collective bargaining. Union organizing, something I'd never even heard mentioned in executive meetings. Workers were apparently so desperate for change that they were risking their jobs to organize. But my executive team had been suppressing these efforts while keeping me completely in the dark. What about the OSHA inspection? Another voice asked, someone I couldn't identify but who is clearly part of the conspiracy. Scheduled for next month, but we've got advance notice through our contacts. Standard procedure: clean up the obvious violations, hide the documentation that might be problematic, make sure the compliant workers are visible during the inspection. The problematic ones will be conveniently assigned to different shifts. The systematic nature of the deception was breathtaking. They had contacts providing advance warning of safety inspections, procedures for hiding evidence of violations, and strategies for manipulating what inspectors would see. This wasn't negligence, it was orchestrated fraud designed to maintain a system that prioritized profit over human safety. The temp workers are working out well, James noted. No benefits, easy to terminate, completely disposable. We should consider expanding the program. Why pay for loyalty when desperation is so much cheaper? Disposable workers, human beings reduced to cost-benefit calculations, their desperation treated as a business opportunity rather than a social crisis requiring compassion. These were the same executives who'd once spoken passionately about corporate social responsibility and the importance of treating employees like family. The meeting continued with discussions of new ways to extract value from workers while minimizing costs and legal exposure. Every suggestion was met with enthusiasm, as if they were competing to see who could devise the most creative forms of exploitation. There was no discussion of worker welfare, no consideration of the human cost of their decisions, no acknowledgement that the people they were discussing were anything more than production inputs. As the meeting ended, and I heard chairs scraping across the floor, I realized the full scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just a case of poor management or misguided policies, it was systematic. Deliberate exploitation orchestrated by people I'd trusted to uphold the values that had once defined my company. The board meeting minutes were more than just lies, they were evidence of a conspiracy to defraud me, the workers, and the public about the true nature of Chen Logistics operations. Every glowing report about workplace culture, every statistic about employee satisfaction, every claim about safety protocols was carefully manufactured fiction designed to hide a reality of systematic abuse. Standing in that maintenance closet, surrounded by cleaning supplies and the smell of industrial disinfectant, I felt the last vestiges of trust and naivety drain away. The people I'd empowered to run my company had betrayed not just me, but every principle I'd tried to build the business on. They'd turned my father's dream into a nightmare while convincing me it was success. Asterisk, the bonus distribution chart was a monument to moral bankruptcy, a spreadsheet that revealed how workers' suffering translated directly into executive wealth. James Morrison's year-end bonus was larger than the combined annual salaries of 12 warehouse workers. Sandra Walsh's performance incentive could have paid for health insurance for 50 families. The numbers were precise, documented, and utterly damning. I'd obtained the chart through careful reconnaissance during my lunch break, slipping into the administrative offices when the skeleton crew was distracted. What I found there made me understand that the systematic abuse wasn't just policy, it was profitable, deliberately designed to maximize executive compensation while minimizing worker welfare. The bonus structure was elegantly vicious. Executive compensation increased in direct proportion to labor cost reductions, productivity improvements, and what the chart euphemistically called workforce efficiency gains. Every bathroom break denied, every safety shortcut taken, every desperate worker pushed beyond their limits generated measurable financial rewards for the people making those decisions. James Morrison had received a $180,000 bonus last quarter, a loan money that came directly from the poverty wages paid to workers like Maria, whose annual salary barely reached $22,000. The math was simple and horrifying. Executive wealth was built on worker misery, and the system had been designed to maximize that extraction, but the bonuses were just the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. The chart revealed expense accounts that would have embarrassed robber barons, company cars that cost more than most workers made in 3 years, and business trips to luxury resorts that had nothing to do with logistics operations. My executives were living like kings while the people who generated their wealth were struggling to afford basic necessities. Sandra Walsh's expenses were particularly egregious. Her monthly car allowance exceeded what most warehouse workers made in 6 weeks. Her professional development budget included spa retreats and golf memberships. While workers were denied basic safety equipment because it was too expensive, the contrast was so stark it felt like satire, except the consequences were devastatingly real. The expendable workforce strategy was laid out in clinical detail. The chart showed how deliberately maintaining high turnover rates reduced benefit costs, eliminated the need for raises, and prevented workers from developing enough job security to demand better treatment. What I'd assumed was a management failure was actually a management success measured, rewarded, and celebrated. The celebration of human misery wasn't metaphorical. The chart included notes about a recent executive retreat where James had presented the labor optimization results to applause from his peers. They'd literally toasted their success at reducing worker welfare while increasing their own compensation. The retreat cost more than the annual salaries of 15 warehouse workers. The psychological impact of seeing these numbers was overwhelming. Every executive bonus represented families choosing between medicine and food, children going without school supplies, workers delaying medical treatment they couldn't afford. The wealth my executives were accumulating came directly from the pockets of people who were already struggling to survive. But perhaps the most damning aspect of the chart was how it revealed the executives' true opinion of the workers who made their wealth possible. Internal communications referred to workers as human inventory, labor units, and disposable resources. There was no pretense of respect or dignity, just cold calculations about how much value could be extracted before replacement became necessary. The bonus system incentivized cruelty in ways I'd never imagined. Supervisors received bonuses for reducing sick leave usage, regardless of whether workers were actually sick. Managers were rewarded for minimizing workers' compensation claims, creating incentives to cover up injuries rather than address them. Every aspect of human welfare had been turned into a competition to see who could cause the most suffering while maintaining legal deniability. I found emails celebrating particularly successful efficiency improvements, increases in productivity that had pushed workers to the breaking point. The tone was gleeful, as if causing human suffering was a game rather than a moral catastrophe. These weren't people who'd gradually lost their way. These were individuals who'd deliberately chosen profit over basic human decency. The chart also revealed how the executives had been manipulating my perception of company performance. The worker satisfaction surveys I'd seen were fabricated. The safety improvement metrics were lies, and the productivity gains were achieved through methods that would have horrified me if I'd known the truth. They'd created an elaborate fiction to keep me happy while they systematically destroyed everything I'd tried to build. The financial projections were equally revealing. The executives were planning to expand the optimization strategies to other facilities, essentially franchising their system of abuse across my entire company. They saw worker suffering not as a problem to solve but as a business model to replicate, a sustainable source of profit that could be scaled indefinitely. Standing in that office, staring at numbers that represented the complete moral collapse of my organization, I felt something die inside me. The people I'd trusted hadn't just betrayed my confidence, they'd betrayed every value I'd tried to instill in my company. They'd taken my father's dream of dignity through work and turned it into a nightmare of exploitation and abuse. The bonus distribution chart wasn't just evidence of financial impropriety, it was a map of moral bankruptcy, a detailed blueprint, showing how human decency had been systematically eliminated in pursuit of profit. Every number on that spreadsheet represented a choice to prioritize executive wealth over worker welfare, and every choice had been made deliberately, consciously, and with full knowledge of the human cost. Asterisk, the hidden camera was smaller than a thumb drive, sophisticated enough to capture both video and audio while remaining virtually undetectable. I'd purchased it with cash from a surveillance equipment store, paying extra for the kind of device that investigators use to document corporate fraud. Within days, I had hours of footage showing the systematic abuse, safety violations, and cover-ups that defined daily operations at my own company. The evidence was damning beyond my worst fears. Supervisors instructing workers to ignore safety protocols to meet quotas. Managers coaching each other on how to falsify injury reports. Executives laughing about worker desperation while planning new ways to exploit it. Each piece of footage revealed another layer of systematic cruelty that had been hidden from my view, but documentation was only the first step. The moral weight of what I'd discovered was crushing not just the systematic abuse, but my own complicity in creating the conditions that had allowed it to flourish. Every quarterly report I'd approved, every executive I'd promoted, every time I'd chosen to trust rather than verify, had contributed to the machine that was destroying lives. The planning had to be meticulous. I couldn't simply fire everyone and hope for the best that would create chaos that would ultimately hurt the workers more than the executives. I needed to build a case that was legally bulletproof, financially sustainable, and morally unambiguous. The people responsible for this system had to face consequences, but the innocent workers who'd suffered under it deserved protection and justice. Late at night, in my home office, I began constructing what I privately called the reckoning. Financial forensics revealed years of executive fraud, with bonuses tied to metrics that incentivized abuse. Legal research showed a pattern of labor law violations that could result in criminal charges. Human resources files documented a systematic pattern of discrimination and retaliation that had been hidden from my oversight. The deeper I dug, the more extensive the corruption became. Executives had been taking kickbacks from suppliers in exchange for contracts that resulted in inferior safety equipment. Managers had been falsifying training records to avoid the cost of actual safety education. The entire system had been designed to maximize extraction while minimizing accountability, but the evidence gathering came with a psychological cost. Every day as Mike Rodriguez, witnessing the continued abuse while knowing I had the power to stop it, was eating away at my soul. Watching Maria struggle to make quota while knowing that her supervisor was receiving bonuses for making her life miserable was almost unbearable. The weight of carrying this knowledge while maintaining my cover was becoming crushing. The human cost wasn't just in the workers, it was in me. Marcus Chen had built an empire, but Mike Rodriguez was witnessing its moral bankruptcy firsthand. The disconnect between these two perspectives was creating a kind of psychological vertigo that left me questioning everything I'd believed about success, leadership, and corporate responsibility. I began reaching out quietly to labor attorneys, using intermediaries to avoid revealing my identity, while seeking advice about the best ways to protect workers during the transition I was planning. The legal landscape was complex. Simply exposing the abuse wouldn't automatically protect the victims, and mishandling the situation could result in the entire company collapsing in ways that would devastate the very people I was trying to help. Responsibility was overwhelming. Thousands of workers depended on Chen Logistics for their livelihoods, however inadequate those livelihoods might be. Their families had mortgages, medical bills, and basic survival needs that couldn't wait for perfect justice. Any action I took had to balance the need for accountability with the reality that disrupting the company too dramatically could create even more suffering. The hidden camera footage was just the beginning. I'd also been documenting the financial manipulation, the safety violations, the systematic cover-ups that protected executives while endangering workers. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also dangerous. People who'd built careers on exploitation wouldn't give up their power without a fight. As Mike Rodriguez, I'd learned to see my company through the eyes of its victims. As Marcus Chen, I now had to figure out how to use that knowledge to create justice without destroying the livelihoods of the innocent people caught in the system. The two perspectives were sometimes contradictory. The worker wanted immediate relief, while the CEO understood the need for strategic planning. The storm I was gathering wasn't just about firing executives. It was about fundamentally restructuring a company that had lost its moral compass. The challenge wasn't just removing the people who'd created this system, but building something better in its place. That would require not just moral clarity, but practical wisdom about how to transition from exploitation to dignity without creating chaos. The evidence was ready, the legal strategy was forming, and the moral imperative was clear. But the human cost of action and inaction weighed heavily on every decision. In trying to save my company's soul, I risked destroying the economic foundation that thousands of families depended on. The gathering storm would either cleanse the system or destroy it entirely, and the responsibility for that outcome rested entirely on my shoulders. The original mission statement was yellowed with age. The handwriting faded but still legible. After 23 years, create a company that treats every worker with dignity while building something meaningful for our families. I'd written those words at my kitchen table, fueled by coffee and naive optimism. Believing that success and integrity could coexist in the business world, sitting in my car in the warehouse parking lot at 3 a.m., reading those words by the dome light, I felt the full weight of how far I'd fallen from that original vision. The young man who'd written that statement had believed in the possibility of ethical capitalism, of building wealth without exploiting the people who made that wealth possible. The middle-aged CEO reading it now understood how easily noble intentions could be corrupted by the gravitational pull of quarterly profits. But the mission statement also represented a path back to redemption. The idealistic vision that corporate success had corrupted could be reclaimed, rebuilt, and implemented with the wisdom that only comes from experiencing the consequences of abandoning your principles. The question wasn't whether I could afford to do the right thing, it was whether I could afford not to. The choice between profit and humanity wasn't theoretical anymore. I'd seen the human faces of my company's efficiency improvements, heard the voices of workers pushed beyond their limits, witnessed the systematic destruction of dignity in pursuit of productivity metrics. The financial costs of treating people humanely were clear and measurable. The moral costs of continuing the current system were incalculable. The transformation I was planning would require sacrificing everything I'd built in pursuit of success. Stock prices would fall when investors learned about the increased labor costs. Competitors would gain advantages when we stopped exploiting our workforce. The business press would question my sanity when they realized I was choosing worker welfare over shareholder value. But I'd learned something during my time as Mike Rodriguez that Marcus Chen had forgotten. Success built on human suffering isn't success at all. It's sophisticated theft. The wealth I'd accumulated, the empire I'd built, the reputation I'd cultivated were all tainted by the systematic abuse that had made them possible. Real success would require starting over, building something that honored both my father's memory and the dignity of every person who worked for Chen Logistics. The decision to sacrifice everything for justice wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, inevitable, like finally admitting a truth you'd known all along. Standing in that parking lot, watching the last shift workers stumble to their cars after another night of dehumanizing labor, I realized that I wasn't just choosing between different business strategies, I was choosing between the person I'd become and the person I'd always meant to be. The moral transformation wasn't just about Chen Logistics, it was about me. Mike Rodriguez had shown me what it felt like to be powerless, to be treated as disposable, to have your humanity ignored by people who saw you only as a production input. That experience had changed me in ways that couldn't be undone. I could never again look at productivity reports without seeing the human faces behind the numbers. From CEO to moral crusader wasn't a career change, was a spiritual awakening. The comfortable distance between executive decisions and their human consequences had been permanently collapsed. Every policy choice, every budget decision, every strategic initiative would now be filtered through the knowledge of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of corporate indifference. The original mission statement wasn't just a relic of youthful idealism, it was a blueprint for redemption. The company my father had dreamed of, where dignity and prosperity could coexist, was still possible. It would require abandoning the current model of extraction and exploitation in favor of something that had never been tried in corporate America: genuine partnership between capital and labor. The financial implications were staggering: paying living wages, providing comprehensive health care, ensuring safe working conditions, and treating workers as human beings rather than production inputs would dramatically increase operating costs. Shareholders would revolt. Competitors would celebrate, and the business media would write obituaries for my career. But the alternative, continuing to build wealth on a foundation of human misery, was no longer acceptable. The path forward was clear. Even if the destination was uncertain, I would use Marcus Chen's power to implement Mike Rodriguez's perspective, transforming Chen Logistics from a machine of exploitation into something unprecedented in modern capitalism, a company that measured success by human flourishing rather than profit extraction. The transition would be painful, expensive, and potentially catastrophic for my personal wealth. But sitting in that parking lot, holding the faded mission statement that represented my father's dreams and my own abandoned principles, I realized that I'd rather be poor and moral than wealthy and complicit. The empire I'd built had to be destroyed so that something better could rise from its ashes. The only question was whether I had the courage to light the match myself. The transformation from CEO to moral crusader was complete. Marcus Chen had learned what Mike Rodriguez already knew. Human dignity isn't a luxury that can be sacrificed for efficiency. It's the foundation upon which any meaningful success must be built. The reckoning I was planning wasn't just about firing executives. It was about reclaiming the soul of a company that had lost its way. The executive ID badge felt foreign in my hands after weeks of wearing Mike Rodriguez's temporary worker pass. The weight of it, both physical and symbolic, represented power I'd forgotten I possessed, and responsibility I'd abdicated. Walking through the marble lobby of Chen Logistics corporate headquarters, past the mission statement etched in granite that had become a mockery of everything the company actually practiced, I felt like I was entering enemy territory. My assistant, Jennifer, nearly dropped her coffee when she saw me. "Mr. Chen, you're not supposed to be back until next week. How was your sabbatical?" The irony of her question would have been amusing if it weren't so tragic. My sabbatical had been an education in the systematic destruction of human dignity, conducted in the basement of my own corporate empire. "It was enlightening," I replied, which was perhaps the greatest understatement of my career. "I need to call an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. All senior executives, mandatory attendance." The familiar routine of corporate power felt surreal after experiencing powerlessness firsthand. The elevator that whisked me to the executive floor in 30 seconds, the corner office with its panoramic view of the city, the mahogany desk that cost more than most workers made in 6 months, all of it seemed like artifacts from a different civilization, one that I now understood was built on foundations of systematic cruelty. James Morrison was the first to arrive for our impromptu meeting, his face showing the kind of confidence that comes from believing you've successfully deceived your boss for years. "Marcus, great to have you back. You look different, more relaxed. The break was good for you." "You could say that," I replied, studying his face with new eyes. This was the man who'd received bonuses for reducing worker bathroom breaks, who'd celebrated increases in productivity that came from pushing people beyond their physical limits. The expensive suit, the confident smile, the casual way he discussed human suffering, it all crystallized into a portrait of institutional evil dressed in corporate respectability. Sandra Walsh arrived next, her designer shoes clicking across the marble floor with the same rhythm that had counted out workers' lives and productivity metrics. "Marcus, we've missed you. James has been keeping me updated on the quarterly projections. We're exceeding targets across all metrics." The word metrics hit me like a physical blow. I knew now what those metrics represented: Mariah's exhaustion, David's untreated pain, Janet's destroyed family. Every percentage point of improvement had a human face, a personal story of sacrifice that had been invisible from this office but undeniable from the warehouse floor. The other executives filed in with similar confidence, unaware that their carefully constructed deceptions were about to collapse. They'd spent months, perhaps years, building elaborate lies about workplace conditions, worker satisfaction, and operational excellence. They had no idea that their CEO had experienced the truth firsthand, that every lie they'd told had been personally witnessed and documented. The boardroom where we gathered had hosted countless meetings where worker welfare had been discussed in abstract terms, where human beings had been reduced to line items and budget spreadsheets. The mahogany table that separated executives from reality was about to become the site of a reckoning that would shatter the comfortable distance between decision-makers and consequences. "Before we begin," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table, "I want to thank you all for your dedication to the company during my absence. Your commitment to our values has been illuminating." The words carried a weight that none of them could detect. To them, I was just another CEO returning from a corporate retreat, ready to praise their efficiency improvements and costs measures. They had no idea that I'd spent the last month experiencing those improvements from the perspective of their victims. Setting up the confrontation required all my remaining self-control. Every instinct screamed at me to immediately expose their crimes, to unleash the fury that had been building for weeks. But the workers who'd suffered under their system deserved more than emotional catharsis. They deserved justice that would stick, accountability that would protect them, and changes that would last beyond my initial anger. The calm before the storm was electric with tension. I could feel, but they couldn't. James was already pulling out his quarterly reports, ready to present statistics about productivity improvements and cost reductions. Sandra was preparing to discuss expansion plans that would spread their model of exploitation to new facilities. They were about to celebrate the systematic destruction of human dignity, completely unaware that their audience had experienced that destruction personally. Looking around the table at faces I'd once trusted, I felt the weight of betrayal settling over me like a physical presence. These weren't just employees who'd made mistakes. They were architects of systematic cruelty who'd deliberately hidden their actions from oversight. The comfortable conference room, with its leather chairs and crystal water glasses, was about to become a courtroom where justice would finally be served. The return to power wasn't triumphant, it was necessary. Marcus Chen had the authority to stop the machine that was grinding up human lives, but only because Mike Rodriguez had experienced what that machine actually did to people. The synthesis of those two perspectives was about to reshape everything that Chen Logistics had become, starting with the people who'd perverted its mission beyond recognition. The termination documents were already prepared, printed on company letterhead, and waiting in my desk drawer like instruments of justice. Unlike the cruel form letters that had destroyed workers' lives, these were personalized, detailed, and legally bulletproof. Each one documented specific instances of fraud, abuse, and systematic violation of both company policy and federal law. Before we review the quarterly reports, I began, my voice steady despite the fury burning in my chest. I want to share some observations from my recent sabbatical. I pressed play on the laptop connected to the conference room's large screen. The hidden camera footage began, rolling Kevin Martinez instructing workers to ignore safety protocols. Supervisors celebrating the termination of injured employees, managers laughing about worker desperation. The room fell silent, except for the damning audio of their own voices discussing human beings as disposable resources. James Morrison's face went white as he recognized his own voice, discussing labor optimization strategies. Sandra Walsh's confident smile evaporated as she watched herself dismissing safety concerns because they might impact productivity metrics. One by one, the executives realized they were watching evidence of their own systematic cruelty. "Where did you get this?" James stammered, his voice barely audible. "I got it by doing something none of you have done in years," I replied leaden. Each word carried the weight of accumulated rage. "I went to the warehouse floor. I worked alongside the people whose lives you've been systematically destroying. I experienced firsthand what it's like to be treated as disposable by the executives of Chen Logistics." The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the continued audio from the footage showing supervisors coaching each other on how to falsify injury reports. Sandra was staring at the screen in horror, watching herself discuss union organizers as problems to be eliminated rather than workers exercising their legal rights. "This is surveillance," James said, his legal training kicking in despite his shock. "A legal recording of private conversations." "Actually," I replied, "it's documentation of criminal activity, labor law violations, safety fraud, conspiracy to defraud workers of rightful compensation. Would you like me to continue with the financial forensics, showing how your bonuses were directly tied to worker exploitation?" I pulled out the bonus distribution charts, spreading them across the mahogany table like evidence in a murder trial. The numbers told their own story: executive wealth, built directly on worker misery, bonuses that increased in proportion to human suffering, financial incentives that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. "James, your bonus last quarter was $180,000. That's more than 8 warehouse workers make in an entire year. Sandra, your performance incentives could have provided health insurance for 50 families. Every dollar you've extracted from this company has come directly from the poverty wages and dangerous working conditions you've imposed on our employees." The desperate justifications began immediately. "We were just following industry standards," Sandra protested. "Everyone operates this way. We were protecting shareholder value." "You were stealing," I replied, my voice cutting through their rationalizations like a blade. "Stealing from workers, stealing from me, stealing from every principle this company was founded on, and you were doing it systematically, deliberately, while lying to my face about workplace conditions and employee welfare." James tried a different approach. "Marcus, be reasonable. Yes, we pushed hard on efficiency, but that's what made the company profitable. You can't run a business on sentiment. The workers knew what they were signing up for. Did they know they were signing up to have their bathroom breaks monitored and penalized? Did they know they were signing up for quotas designed to be impossible to meet? Did they know they were signing up to have their injuries covered up to protect your bonuses?" The evidence was overwhelming, and their explanations grew increasingly desperate. Sandra claimed she was just following orders, despite the recordings showing her initiating many of the abusive policies. James insisted the financial manipulations were standard practice, ignoring the clear documentation of fraud and embezzlement. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, pulling out the termination documents. "Half of this executive team is fired, effective immediately, not for performance issues, not for reorganization, but for systematic violation of labor laws, deliberate fraud, and conspiracy to exploit workers while lying to company leadership about your actions." The shock was complete. These were people who'd never faced consequences for their actions, who'd built careers on exploiting those beneath them, while maintaining plausible deniability with those above them. The idea that their systematic cruelty would result in personal accountability was apparently beyond their comprehension. "You can't do this," James said, his voice rising with panic. "We have contracts, severance agreements, legal protections." "Your contracts are void due to criminal fraud," I replied. "Your severance agreements don't apply when you're terminated for cause. Your legal protections disappear when you systematically violate the law." I've spent weeks documenting every crime, every lie, every instance of deliberate abuse. This isn't revenge, it's justice. Sandra made one last desperate attempt. Think about the company's reputation. If this gets out, if there's negative publicity, the company's reputation has been built on lies. I cut her off. I'd rather have an honest company that struggles financially than a profitable company that succeeds through systematic abuse. Some things are more important than quarterly reports. The swift and decisive justice wasn't emotional, it was surgical. Each termination was documented, justified, and legally unassailable. These weren't impulsive decisions made in anger, but carefully planned consequences for years of deliberate wrongdoing. The people who'd built careers on exploiting workers were finally experiencing what it felt like to be disposable, as security escorted the terminated executives from the building. Their careers destroyed as quickly and callously as they'd destroyed workers' lives. I felt no satisfaction, only a grim sense that justice had finally been served. The machine of exploitation they'd built was about to be dismantled, and the workers who'd suffered under their system would finally have advocates instead of adversaries in the executive suite. The new employee charter was written in plain English, without the legal doublespeak that had allowed the previous administration to systematically abuse workers while maintaining plausible deniability. Every employee has the right to safe working conditions, fair compensation, dignity in the workplace, and representation without retaliation. Simple words that would fundamentally reshape how Chen Logistics operated. Firing half the executive team was just the beginning. The institutional culture they'd created had infected every level of management, turning supervisors into enforcers of exploitation and middle managers into collaborators in systematic abuse. The purge had to be comprehensive to be effective, rooting out everyone who'd built their careers on treating workers as disposable resources. Kevin Martinez was among the first supervisors to be terminated. His personnel file documented years of safety violations, discriminatory practices, and deliberate cruelty toward workers under his supervision. The termination meeting was brief. Presented the evidence. He offered weak justifications, and security escorted him from the building with the same callous efficiency he'd used to destroy workers' lives. This is insane, he protested as he was led away. You can't run a business treating workers like kings. The numbers won't work. Then we'll change the numbers, I replied. We'll change everything that needs changing to treat people like human beings instead of production inputs. The immediate reforms were dramatic and expensive. Quotas were reduced to humane levels. Bathroom breaks were unlimited. Safety equipment was upgraded regardless of cost. And supervisory positions were filled by people who understood that their job was to support workers rather than exploit them. The financial impact was immediate, and substantial operating costs increased by 30% in the first month alone. The resistance from remaining executives was predictable and fierce. You're destroying the company, warned Robert Kim, one of the few senior managers to survive the initial purge. Shareholders will revolt. Competitors will eat us alive. This isn't sustainable. What wasn't sustainable was building profit on human suffering, I replied. We're going to prove that ethical business practices can coexist with financial success, even if it takes longer and costs more. Implementing new policies required more than just changing rules. It required changing minds. Middle managers who'd spent years treating workers as enemies had to learn to see them as partners. Supervisors who'd measured success by productivity metrics had to understand that employee welfare was equally important. The cultural transformation was more challenging than the policy changes. The worker feedback forms revealed the depth of institutional damage that had been hidden from my view. Stories of systematic harassment, discriminatory practices, safety violations, and financial manipulation filled hundreds of pages. Each form represented a person whose dignity had been systematically stripped away by the corporate machine I'd unknowingly created. Maria's feedback was particularly heartbreaking. I stayed because I needed the job, but I lost myself here. Every day was about surviving until the end of shift, never about building anything meaningful. I forgot what it felt like to be treated like a person instead of a machine. The promoted workers brought fresh perspectives that challenged every assumption about how businesses had to operate. David, the arthritic former picker who became a supervisor, implemented rest rotation systems that increased both productivity and worker satisfaction. Rosa, promoted to shift manager, developed scheduling systems that respected workers' family obligations while maintaining operational efficiency, but the financial cost of doing what's right was staggering. Healthcare costs increased dramatically. When workers actually felt safe seeking medical attention, productivity initially dropped as workers adjusted to humane quotas and adequate break periods. Training costs exploded as we invested in developing workers rather than simply using them up and replacing them. The short-term losses were devastating for my personal wealth. Stock prices plummeted when investors realized that Chen Logistics was prioritizing worker welfare over shareholder value. My net worth dropped by 60% in the first quarter, and financial analysts predicted complete collapse within 2 years. The competitors' response was swift and predictable. They poached clients with promises of lower costs made possible by continuing the exploitative practices I'd abandoned. Chen Logistics has lost its competitive edge. Read One Industry Analysis. Their new labor policies make them unviable in the current market. But the integrity of the transformation wasn't just about business metrics, it was about moral metrics that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports. Workers who'd been broken by years of systematic abuse were slowly regaining their humanity. Families that had been torn apart by impossible schedules were reconnecting. The warehouse floors that had once resembled prison yards were becoming places where people could find dignity through work. The new employee charter wasn't just a document, it was a declaration of war against the entire model of modern capitalism that treated workers as costs to be minimized rather than assets to be developed. Every policy change, every promoted worker, every improvement in working conditions was a repudiation of the system that had nearly destroyed my company's soul. Standing in the warehouse that had once been a site of systematic abuse, watching workers who were no longer afraid to make eye contact or take bathroom breaks, I realized that the financial costs were irrelevant compared to the human benefits. Chen Logistics might become smaller, less profitable, and less competitive, but it would finally become the company my father had dreamed of, and I had originally intended to build. The purge was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Building something better from the ashes of systematic exploitation would require sustained commitment, financial sacrifice, and the courage to prove that businesses could succeed while treating workers as human beings, deserving of dignity and respect. The worker feedback forms arrived daily now, but their tone had fundamentally changed. Instead of desperate pleas for basic human dignity, they contained suggestions for improvement, expressions of gratitude, and ideas for making the company more efficient while maintaining respect for workers. The transformation was visible not just in policies but in the faces of people who'd rediscovered hope. Maria's latest feedback form was representative of the change. For the first time in 6 years, I don't dread coming to work. My supervisor asks about my family, my schedule accommodates my children's needs, and I feel like my voice matters. I've started taking community college classes because I believe there might be a future here. The new policies and procedures were revolutionary by industry standards but basic by human standards. Living wages that allowed workers to support their families without government assistance, comprehensive healthcare that didn't bankrupt families facing medical emergencies, safe working conditions that prioritized human welfare over productivity metrics, scheduling systems that respected workers' need for work-life balance. David, now a supervisor, had implemented innovations that proved worker welfare and efficiency could coexist. His rest rotation system reduced injuries by 60%, while actually increasing productivity as workers who weren't exhausted performed better. When people feel respected, he told me, they give their best effort. When they feel exploited, they give just enough to avoid getting fired. The promoted workers brought perspectives that had been invisible to traditional management structures. Rosa had redesigned the warehouse layout based on actual user experience, rather than theoretical efficiency models. Her changes reduced walking time by 20% while creating rest areas where workers could recover between tasks. The improvements came from understanding the work rather than just managing it. Patricia, promoted to safety coordinator, had identified dozens of hazards that had been ignored by previous management because addressing them would impact productivity. Her comprehensive safety program increased costs in the short term, but reduced insurance premiums and workers' compensation claims in the long term. Safety isn't expensive, she observed. Injuries are expensive, but implementing ethical business practices required constant vigilance against the gravitational pull of competitive pressure. Every month brought new challenges as clients demanded lower prices that could only be achieved by returning to exploitative practices. Your competitors are undercutting you by 20%, warned our largest client. Match their prices, or lose our business. Then we'll lose your business, I replied. We won't return to treating workers as disposable resources, regardless of the financial pressure. The financial cost of maintaining integrity was relentless. Monthly operating costs had increased by 40%, forcing difficult decisions about expansion, investment, and long-term planning. The company that had once grown aggressively now had to focus on sustainable practices that prioritized stability over rapid growth. Some clients departed immediately when they realized Chen Logistics would no longer compete on the basis of worker exploitation. Others, surprisingly, became more loyal when they understood they were partnering with a company that aligned with their own stated values. We want to work with businesses that reflect our principles, explained one major retailer. Your reputation for ethical practices has become a competitive advantage. The employee satisfaction surveys told a story of transformation that couldn't be captured in financial metrics. Workers who'd been planning to quit were now recommending the company to family members. Absenteeism dropped as people who'd once called in sick to escape workplace abuse now looked forward to coming to work. Productivity increased as workers, who felt respected, invested emotionally in company success. The challenge of maintaining profitability while treating workers ethically required innovative approaches that traditional business schools didn't teach. Cross-training workers to handle multiple roles reduced the need for temporary slave labor while providing employees with valuable skills. Profit-sharing programs aligned worker interests with company success while providing additional income for families that had been struggling on poverty wages. The ongoing responsibility of ethical leadership was more demanding than the traditional focus on shareholder value. Every decision had to be evaluated not just for financial impact, but for human impact. Policy changes that might increase efficiency had to be assessed for their effects on worker dignity. Cost-cutting measures had to be balanced against their implications for employee welfare. The transformation attracted attention from labor organizations, business schools, and media outlets interested in whether ethical capitalism was actually possible. Chen Logistics is conducting a real-world experiment, wrote one business journalist. Can a company succeed financially while prioritizing worker welfare over shareholder value? The early results are encouraging but inconclusive. The worker feedback forms had become more than just communication tools. They were evidence that systematic change was possible, that businesses could choose humanity over exploitation and still function effectively. Every suggestion implemented, every worker promoted, every policy changed based on employee input proved that those closest to the work often had the best ideas for improving it. Standing in the warehouse that had once been a site of systematic abuse, watching workers who now smiled and made eye contact, who felt safe suggesting improvements and reporting problems, I realized that building something better wasn't just about changing policies. It was about changing the fundamental relationship between capital and labor. The financial implications were still uncertain. The company was smaller, less profitable, and more vulnerable to competitive pressure than it had been under the exploitative system. But it was finally becoming the organization my father had dreamed of, a place where dignity and prosperity could coexist, where success was measured not just in quarterly profits, but in the quality of life of the people who made that success possible. The financial statements told a stark story of what ethical transformation actually cost. Operating expenses had increased by 42%, profit margins had shrunk to levels that made investors nervous, and quarterly growth had slowed to a crawl. The numbers that had once been my source of pride now reflected the price of treating workers as human beings rather than production inputs. Revenue had dropped by 18% as clients fled to competitors who could offer lower prices through continued exploitation of their workforce. Major contracts had been canceled when Chen Logistics refused to match bids that could only be achieved by returning to poverty, wages, and dangerous working conditions. The market was sending a clear message. Ethical business practices were a luxury that came with serious financial consequences. My personal wealth had evaporated with stunning speed. Stock options that had once been worth millions were now essentially worthless. The house I'd purchased at the height of my success was mortgaged beyond its current value. My retirement portfolio, built on the systematic exploitation I'd finally ended, had shrunk to levels that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Competitors were indeed celebrating our transformation, though not for the reasons I'd expected. Rather than simply stealing our clients, they were using our example to justify their own continued abuse of workers. Look what happens when you go soft, their sales teams would tell potential clients. Chen Logistics tried to be the good guys, and nearly went bankrupt. We focus on results, not sentiment. The challenge of maintaining profitability while treating workers ethically required fundamental changes to business models that had been considered unchangeable. Traditional logistics companies competed on speed and cost, metrics that inherently favored exploitation over dignity. We had to find new ways to create value that didn't depend on grinding down human beings. Innovation became a necessity, born of moral commitment. Since we couldn't compete on worker exploitation, we had to compete on efficiency, quality, and reliability. Workers who felt respected and valued began suggesting improvements that MBA consultants had missed. The warehouse redesigns proposed by actual workers were more effective than expensive consulting studies. The standing firm in the face of adversity required daily decisions to choose principle over profit. When the largest remaining client demanded a 20% cost reduction that could only be achieved by cutting wages, I walked away from a contract worth $12 million annually. When investors threatened to remove me as CEO unless I returned to industry-standard labor practices, I prepared my resignation letter. But resistance to competitive pressure also revealed unexpected sources of strength. A new generation of clients began seeking out Chen Logistics specifically because of our ethical practices. Companies that had their own corporate social responsibility commitments found that partnering with us enhanced their own reputation rather than creating liability. The employee loyalty that resulted from treating workers with dignity translated into measurable business advantages. Turnover dropped to negligible levels, eliminating the constant costs of recruiting and training new workers. Experienced employees who understood the systems performed more efficiently than the revolving door of desperate workers we'd previously employed. Quality improvements became a natural byproduct of worker investment in company success. When employees felt like partners rather than adversaries, they took pride in their work that translated into fewer errors, better customer service, and innovations that improved operations. The hidden costs of low moral mistakes, theft, sabotage, and deliberate inefficiency disappeared almost overnight. The insurance and legal costs that had plagued the company under the previous system also declined dramatically. Workers' compensation claims dropped when safety became a genuine priority rather than a legal fiction. Legal expenses decreased when employees trusted management enough to resolve disputes internally rather than pursuing external remedies. The challenge wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Every day brought reminders of how much easier business had been when I'd been willing to ignore the human cost of success. The comfortable detachment that had allowed me to celebrate productivity improvements without considering their impact on actual people was no longer possible. Industry analysts predicted total collapse within 18 months, citing unsustainable labor costs and competitive disadvantages that would eventually destroy the company. Chen's social experiment is admirable, wrote one respected business publication. But business fundamentals don't change because of good intentions. The market will eventually force a return to reality. The pressure to return to exploitative practices was constant and seductive. Every financial statement, every lost contract, every investor meeting brought suggestions that we could gradually dial back the reforms, return to industry standards, and regain competitive advantage. The rationalizations were always couched in concern for worker welfare. If the company failed completely, everyone would lose their jobs. But the price of truth wasn't just financial, it was the cost of rebuilding trust, credibility, and moral authority that had been destroyed by years of systematic deception. Every policy change had to be proven through actions rather than promises. Every commitment to worker welfare had to be demonstrated through sustained investment rather than convenient rhetoric. The transformation required accepting that some forms of success weren't worth achieving if they required abandoning fundamental principles. The wealthy CEO who had built an empire on worker exploitation was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real success could only be measured by the impact on everyone affected by business decisions. Standing firm against adversity meant accepting that Chen Logistics might become smaller, less profitable, and less influential, but it would finally become something worthy of the principles it claimed to represent. The price of truth was steep, but the cost of continued deception would have been the complete destruction of everything meaningful about the company my father had inspired me to build. Emma's new company badge carried a title that would have been impossible under the old system: Worker Advocacy Coordinator. At 23, she was leading initiatives to ensure that worker voices were heard at every level of Hispania, that the transformation I'd begun would survive beyond my tenure as CEO. Her presence in the company represented both redemption and accountability, a constant reminder of why the changes had been necessary. "Dad, you should see the difference," she told me during one of our weekly check-ins about company culture. "Workers actually smile now. They make suggestions without fear of retaliation." Maria told me yesterday that she's planning to finish her degree because she finally believes she has a future here. The long-term results of the transformation were beginning to emerge after 18 months of sustained commitment to ethical practices. Employee satisfaction scores had reached levels that industry consultants claimed were impossible in logistics operations. Productivity, after an initial decline during the transition, had rebounded to exceed previous metrics while maintaining humane working conditions. The employee loyalty improvements weren't just emotional, they were measurable in ways that affected the bottom line. The institutional knowledge retained by workers who no longer fled the company translated into operational efficiencies that MBA consultants couldn't replicate. Experienced workers who understood both the systems and the company's values became force multipliers for productivity and quality. Quality metrics told a story of transformation that extended beyond the warehouse floor. Customer satisfaction ratings had improved dramatically as workers who felt respected treated customers with corresponding dignity. Order accuracy increased when employees took pride in their work, rather than simply trying to survive their shifts. The ripple effects of treating workers humanely extended throughout the entire operation. The company's new reputation and success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Business schools began studying Chen Logistics as a case study in ethical transformation. Labor organizations pointed to our example as proof that worker welfare and business success could coexist. Media coverage, initially skeptical, became increasingly positive as the results spoke for themselves. Major clients who had initially fled to competitors began returning, drawn by quality and reliability that exploitation-based operations couldn't match. "Your workers care about getting things right," explained one client who had returned after a disastrous experience with a competitor. "When people feel valued, they deliver value." The personal relationships that had been healed and strengthened extended beyond my family to include workers who had become genuinely invested in company success. Maria, now a shift supervisor, had completed her community college degree and was working toward a bachelor's degree in business administration. David had become a safety training coordinator, using his decades of warehouse experience to prevent others from suffering the injuries that had plagued him. Worker development programs that would have been considered wasteful expenses under the old system proved to be investments that paid dividends in unexpected ways. Cross-training initiatives reduced dependence on temporary labor while providing employees with valuable skills. Educational assistance programs created internal promotion pipelines that retained institutional knowledge while providing workers with advancement opportunities. The profit-sharing system that had seemed financially risky during implementation proved to align worker interests with company success in ways that traditional management techniques couldn't achieve. Workers who received quarterly bonuses based on company performance became advocates for efficiency improvements, quality initiatives, and cost-saving measures that didn't compromise their welfare. Industry recognition came slowly but steadily. Chen Logistics received awards for workplace safety, employee satisfaction, and corporate social responsibility. More importantly, we began receiving inquiries from other companies interested in implementing similar transformations. The example we'd set was inspiring others to question the assumption that exploitation was necessary for success. The financial performance, while not matching the extraordinary profits of the exploitation era, had stabilized at levels that supported sustainable growth and worker welfare. Revenue had recovered to 90% of previous levels. But with operating margins that reflected the true cost of ethical business practices, the company was smaller but healthier, less profitable but more sustainable. But transformation had created a virtuous cycle where treating workers well led to better performance, which led to satisfied customers, which led to sustainable profits, which supported continued investment in worker welfare. The system was self-reinforcing in ways that the previous model of exploitation could never be. Emma's role in ensuring the sustainability of the changes extended beyond her official duties. She had become the conscience of the company, the person who would ask uncomfortable questions if policies began sliding back toward exploitation. Her generation's expectations for workplace dignity would prevent the kind of gradual erosion that had corrupted the company's original mission. The ongoing work of redemption required constant vigilance against the temptation to return to easier but immoral practices. Every financial pressure, every competitive challenge, every difficult quarter brought suggestions that temporary compromises in worker welfare might be necessary. Emma's presence, and the culture we'd built together, made such compromises impossible to justify. Looking around the warehouse that had once been a site of systematic abuse, seeing workers who had dignity in their posture and hope in their eyes, I realized that redemption wasn't a destination but a daily choice. The path we'd chosen required sustained commitment, but it led to a place where success and integrity could finally coexist. The company Emma had joined wasn't perfect, but it was finally becoming worthy of the principles it claimed to uphold. The transformation that had begun with her tears over mistreatment of workers had evolved into a new model of business that proved exploitation wasn't necessary for success. It was simply the easier path for leaders who lacked the courage to do better. The updated mission statement was handwritten like the original, but the words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom rather than naive optimism. To build a company where every person's dignity is honored, where success is measured by the positive impact on all stakeholders, and where the pursuit of profit never comes at the expense of human welfare. The document reflected not just intentions, but tested principles proven through sacrifice and sustained commitment. 2 years after my transformation from CEO to moral crusader, I found myself sitting in the same office where I'd once celebrated productivity improvements without considering their human cost. The view from the window was unchanged, but my perspective had been fundamentally altered by experiencing the company from the bottom up. The distance between executive decisions and their consequences had been permanently collapsed. The reflection on the journey and its lessons couldn't be separated from the ongoing responsibility they'd created. Every policy decision, every budget allocation, every strategic choice now carried the weight of knowing exactly how such decisions affected the people who implemented them. Mike Rodriguez's perspective had become permanently integrated into Marcus Chen's decision-making process. The experience had changed me in ways that extended far beyond business operations. The comfortable assumptions about success, leadership, and corporate responsibility that had once defined my worldview had been shattered by direct exposure to their consequences. Wealth built on exploitation wasn't wealth at all. It was theft made legal through systematic power imbalances. The ongoing responsibility of ethical leadership required constant vigilance against the gradual erosion of principles under competitive pressure. Every month brought new challenges that tested our commitment to treating workers as human beings rather than production inputs. The market still rewarded exploitation and punished dignity, making ethical business practices a daily choice rather than a natural outcome. The fundamental change wasn't just in company policies, but in my understanding of what leadership actually meant. True leadership required serving the people who trusted you with power, not exploiting that trust for personal gain. The executives I'd fired had confused authority with license, using their positions to extract value rather than create it. The transformation had revealed how easily good intentions could be corrupted by the gravitational pull of quarterly profits and competitive pressure. The young man who'd written the original mission statement hadn't been naive about wanting to treat workers with dignity. He'd been naive about how difficult it would be to maintain those principles once the business became successful. The legacy I now chose to build was fundamentally different from the empire I'd once pursued. Instead of maximizing personal wealth through systematic exploitation, the goal had become proving that businesses could succeed while honoring the dignity of everyone affected by their operations. The challenge was demonstrating that ethical capitalism wasn't an oxymoron but a viable alternative to the extraction-based model that dominated modern business. The hard-won wisdom wasn't just about business practices but about the psychological and moral costs of abandoning principles for profit. The wealthy CEO, who had ignored worker suffering, hadn't been happier than the reformed leader, who now prioritized human welfare over shareholder value. Success built on exploitation created a kind of spiritual poverty that no amount of financial wealth could fill. The company that emerged from transformation wasn't perfect, but it was finally aligned with the values it claimed to represent. Workers were treated as partners rather than adversaries. Safety was a genuine priority rather than a legal fiction, and success was measured by sustainable impact rather than quarterly extraction. The business model proved that dignity and profitability could coexist when leaders chose long-term thinking over short-term gains. The ongoing work required accepting that some competitive advantages weren't worth pursuing if they required abandoning fundamental principles. Companies that continued to exploit workers might always have certain cost advantages, but they would never have the employee loyalty, quality, performance, and sustainable practices that ethical operations could achieve. The updated mission statement served as both aspiration and accountability measure, a reminder that principles needed to be tested through sustained action rather than convenient rhetoric. The document wasn't just about Chen logistics, but about the possibility of business serving human flourishing rather than extracting from it. The man in the mirror looked different than the CEO, who had once celebrated efficiency improvements without considering their human cost. The transformation had required sacrificing personal wealth, competitive advantage, and industry status, but it had recovered something more valuable: the ability to sleep at night knowing that business success wasn't being built on systematic human suffering. The journey from exploitation to dignity had been expensive, difficult, and often lonely. Industry peers considered the transformation naive. Competitors used it as a competitive advantage, and investors fled to more profitable opportunities. But workers who had been treated as disposable now had hope for the future. Families torn apart by impossible schedules were healing, and a new generation was learning that business could be a force for human flourishing rather than degradation. Standing in that office, looking out at a city where thousands of workers were still trapped in systems of systematic exploitation, I realized that the real measure of success wasn't what we'd accomplished, but what we'd inspired others to attempt. If Chen Logistics could prove that ethical business practices were viable, perhaps other leaders would find the courage to choose dignity over exploitation, principle over profit, and long-term human welfare over short-term financial gain. The legacy I now chose to build wasn't about personal wealth or industry dominance. It was about demonstrating that another way was possible, that businesses could serve human dignity rather than exploit it, and that the choice between profit and principle was a false dilemma created by leaders who lacked the courage to pursue both simultaneously.